Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the second session of this really cool series we've got going. Just a reminder, there's one more session. It's in 2 weeks. It's going to be great. I see a lot of you that I recognize from 2 weeks ago, and so I'm going to skip the whole Gil Harel bio thing because most of you know him, and the rest of you heard it last week. And we got a lot of music to listen to tonight. So let's get to it and turn the stage over to my friend Gil.
Thank you. Wow. Michael asked me when I arrived, he said, "How you feeling?" I said, "I get to talk about Dave Brubeck and odd time signatures. How could I be anything but great?" Before we talk about the 3 albums that we'll be analyzing this evening, I want to say just a few words about odd time signatures, because many of us were here in attendance last spring when I talked about 1959's Time Out, that seminal album that really was so novel in 1959, and even today we know from the statistics in terms of sales and downloads and the like, remains one of the most cherished albums in the jazz canon. For those who weren't here last April, or for those who would like a refresher, we could all use a refresher. I want to say a few words about odd time signatures, because in order to understand just how novel these were in the realm of jazz, we should understand how basically non-existent odd time signatures were historically in Western music. If you go back to the birth of time signatures, remember what a time signature is in music. All that is really is a way of organizing notes into a recognizable pattern that repeats. That's it. Strong beats, weak beats. You can make it that simple. To find the earliest incarnation of time signatures, we'd have to go back to the late Renaissance, if you can believe it, to the late 16th century. Now, it's true in the early Renaissance and even to a degree in the late medieval period, they had ways of organizing beats, but it was very different from our modern system that emerged, say, 400 years ago. So if we start, you go back to the Renaissance, they had a basic concept of tempus perfectum, tempus imperfectum. Imperfect time was 4/4, basically what we would call duple meter. Why is it imperfect? Because it's synonymous with temporal matters. The 4 seasons on earth, for example, worldly things which are imperfect by nature. Whereas triple meter, well, that's got to be perfect time, right? Because 3, in the Renaissance, for example, or in the late Middle Ages, or even after the Reformation, didn't matter. You could go to Luther in Germany, you could go to Calvinist Switzerland, you could ask the disciples of Ulrich Zwingli, another important theologian of the period. They all would have agreed that 3 was a propitious number. It was a sacred number because of the Trinity. And so they had this basic dichotomy hundreds of years ago that they understood that you could basically organize things into 3 or 4. Skip from 1600 on, and what you find is there's an almost absolute dearth of anything outside of those meters. It's either 4 or 3. And the 4 is the more common one. In fact, it's so common that guess what musicians call 4/4? Common time. When it's notated, you'll just see a C in the staff right after the clef and the key signature. Just a C, common time. Now, what about in the 19th century? After all, we know that composers in the 19th century, well, they were pretty adventurous, weren't they? That Beethoven fella was pretty adventurous. Do we find anything really unusual in Beethoven? Yes and no. I would suggest that the strangest Beethoven example when it comes to time signatures can be found in the second movement of his Opus 111 piano sonata. That's the last one. He wrote 32 sonatas. In the 32nd sonata, Beethoven goes in the second movement to 12/32 time. And it is, when it comes to reading it or even trying to sight read it, it would be an unpleasant experience for the sight reader in question. You would not want to have to sight read Beethoven's Opus 111 movement 2. 12/32 time, but if we do the math, we think, well, 12/32 is really just like 3/8 in a way. And as such, it is a variant of triple meter. All of this is to say that if you go back to the Renaissance, to the time of tempus perfectum, which would be 3, and tempus imperfectum, the world, the time that could be represented in the temporal fallen world that we live in, that was duple meter, essentially. And for hundreds of years, that's all you see. Even when you get to Beethoven, who was the paradigmatic example of the musical maverick, yes, you see odd things, 6/16, 12/32, but they're really just variants of recognizable pattern. That's all a time signature is a pattern, a recognizable pattern of strong beats and weak beats. Now, it's true, when you get to the late 19th century, composers are starting to explore, in a limited way, odd time signatures. And really what you find is that to create an odd time signature, it's not that crazy of an idea. Remember, we said that the time signatures that existed basically since the advent of time signatures included either a triple meter or a duple meter variant. So what's the logical, let's say, extrapolation from there? Put them together. 3 plus 4 equals 7. Why not have something in 7? And that's exactly what we get on an album that came out just a couple of years after 1959's Time Out. Now, in our spring program, we talked about just how challenging Time Out was for the band to record. In fact, thanks to Michael and the Brubeck archives, we were able to get audio, some of you were here for that, of those recording sessions where you can hear they have to stop abruptly and start a new take, because it was not just in the realm of classical concert music or even in the impressionist music that, for example, Brubeck would have known studying with Darius Milhaud at Mills. You still find odd time signature is pretty rare, exceptionally rare, I would say. I can think of only a few examples in concert music of the late 19th century. Say Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition, if you know 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 1 and 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. 1 and 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we can call that 11 or so. By the way, cool thing about that, Mussorgsky probably wanted it to sound off-kilter because if you know that piece, the promenade theme is supposed to represent the visitor at the gallery, sort of ambling around in the gallery. And so how do we walk in a gallery? Well, you don't walk in strict military time. You stop here, you pause there, maybe you speed up a little bit there, maybe you linger here. And so we find a little bit there. Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony. Some of you know the second movement, the Allegro Grazioso, is in quintuple meter. So there are some antecedents, but they are few and far between. What I'm saying, of course, is that Dave Brubeck's idea of having not a song, not a record, but multiple records exploring odd time signatures, totally novel, with no antecedent in jazz or in art music, concert music, whatever you want to call it, of the preceding centuries. Again, some composers had dabbled in it. Mussorgsky and Tchaikovsky come to mind. But nobody had done a study the way Brubeck and the quartet did here in 1959 and in the next 5 years or so. So let's talk about time signatures that you can create using combinations of 3s and 4s, or 3s and 2s, right? When we say duple meter, we could mean a 2 or a 4. Well, I think the one that we probably want to analyze first would be the most logical one. 3 exists, that's tempus imperfectum, and then 4 exists, going all the way back hundreds of years, nearly a millennium. You got tempus imperfectum. What happens? You put them together, septuple meter. Now, can you have music in 7? You sure can. I'll share a brief anecdote with you. When I was right out of grad school, my old college roommate got married in Ann Arbor, and he said, Gil, I really want you to come to the wedding, and can you play at the wedding? And I was like, I play at the wedding. It's your wedding. I don't want to be a guest, but sure. You want me to play at the wedding? I'll play at the wedding. Now, I thought, if I'm going to play at this wedding, well, by golly, I'm going to have some fun. At least at the rehearsal, Michael. Well, I'm not a sociopath. Anyway, they wanted me, I said, I can play I can play Mendelssohn for you, Wagner, what do you want? And I said, we want Pachelbel's Canon. Okay, all right, I understand. So I sit down to play it at the rehearsal, and I played a little bit like this. Let's try that again. D major, right? There we go. Do you hear it? 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Now, where did I get that idea from? Dave Brubeck is where I got that idea from, folks. That's why was I interested in septuple meter in my 20s? Because I've been drinking from the chalice of Brubeck. And it was tracks like the one we're about to listen to that gave me a very clear indication in my sort of the inner ear, what we musicians call the inner ear. That's the hearing without the external source of how one might very easily and coherently and compellingly organize this septuple meter. We get a really funny song on this album from 1961. If you've already explored time signatures with an album called Time Out, and you want to keep doing it, what should you call that album? How about Time Further Out? And on that album is a song called Unsquare Dance. By the way, here's the Brubeck family, and you can see the Unisphere in the background. How many people have been to Flushing Meadow Corona Park in Queens? Not far from where I grew up. I now live Fairfield County, Connecticut. I believe that's what they call an upgrade. My students ask me, they say, "Professor, you grew up in New York City?" I said, well, yes. When you live in New York, you say the city, you mean Manhattan. But yes, I know what you mean. Yes, I grew up in New York City. I grew up in Queens. They say, "What was it like? Tell us about Queens." I said, "Queens is a fantastic place to visit." And here the Brubeck family coming down from Wilton also visited the World Fair in 1963, I guess. Yeah, that must have been 64, 65 actually. Yeah, because you could see Matt's quite young there, but he's not 2. We're going to talk about Matt's birthday because he was born when the team was in the studio writing, and there's a song that was a tribute to him. He was born. So Charles Matthew Hallelujah, if you know the song. Let's listen to Unsquare Dance. I've got 2 videos to share with you. One is sort of an original attempt to choreograph this. And Brubeck jokingly said, you know, Dave had such a great sense of humor, and he said that this song was kind of a warm, friendly challenge to all the snappers, clappers, and foot tappers. By the way, when I played the Paco Bell Canon in 7 that night, the bride came over to me and she said, "That was so beautiful." And then she said, "Can I ask you, is the piano out of tune?" I said, "Out of tune? What do you mean?" She said, "Something sounded off." Now, what she was alluding to is correct. She heard something off, but she had no vocabulary for describing it, unlike all of you erudite folk in the room. We're all scholars now of time signatures, so we know what's going on. She had no vocabulary for it, so her initial impulse was to ask a question that anyone asks when something sounds off in music. You don't really understand the intricacies. You just say, "Is it out of tune?" because that's an expression we hear, and we can kind of understand it to mean something like something's off. But it's a more charitable way of asking, right? So anyway, all right, here's Unsquare Dance. We're going to watch a little bit of this, and then we're going to cut to a more modern choreographed version of this, or choreography that accompanies the song. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. It's a blues. It's just a blues. All right, good. Yes, indeed. Good old, the restart trick always works. You can hear that Joe Morello is playing almost exclusively on the rim of the snare. If you notice that, the rim means the sort of exactly what it sounds like, the outer circumference of the snare drum, and it gives it that clacky, clacky sound. And remember that in writing this song, not only was Dave exploring 7/4 time, but I think there's probably a dotted line somewhere to be drawn to the fact that this is fundamentally a Western phenomenon. Square dancing was a Western phenomenon. This may have been a doffing of the cap, so to speak, from a guy who had migrated to the East Coast, but is maybe paying homage to the West here, because as we know, Dave was a California guy, born and raised. All right, here's a more modern take on this by the Elisa Monte Dance Company, and this was filmed in New York City, and it's juxtaposed with film clip featuring a bunch of great musicians. Randy Jones is on the drums here in this video. You can see how much fun Randy Jones is having. There's a point where Dave is absolutely shredding his solo, and the camera cuts to the drummer. And this is a great thing about drummers. You'll notice sometimes their job is to keep time when there's chaos unfolding in a solo section. Dave was notorious, and I mean that in the best way, for challenging the rhythm players to keep time while he would deliberately do things that were obfuscating the meter or playing a cross rhythm, polyrhythms. It's great, but you can see how much fun Randy Jones is having. By the way, if you look closely in this video, you'll notice that on the bass, none other than Chris Brubeck. Yeah, you'll spot his goatee. And Bill Smith on clarinet. Many of you know that Dave played a lot with Bill Smith, clarinetist. Anyway, let's listen. It's just the blues, by the way. Much of this album is blues music. There's Chris playing bass. There he is. We don't see much of him, but that's him. I want to say a few words about the cover art. I didn't talk about that, but the album had this beautiful cover art by, I think he was a Catalan artist named Juan Miró. And Dave and they like to feature these postmodern, sometimes expressionist, sometimes basically 20th century art on the covers. S. Neil Fujita did the cover art for 1959's Time Out, and Juan Miró did the cover art for this one. There it is. Hear Dave quoting, the sailor's hornpipe there. Then, you might recognize it by the song lyrics, "Do your ears hang low?" If you listen again, just in the last 10 seconds or so. Lot of fun there. By the way, if you notice in the track there, Dave's he's doing a stride piano in his left hand, and he's playing rapid fire in the right hand. It is a myth that is often quoted and promulgated, and it should be debunked. The myth is that Dave somehow couldn't play fast, and he couldn't play, virtuosically like that. He couldn't play stride, and it's all, as they say over across the pond in Ireland, it's malarkey. It's malarkey. Sometimes people attribute, they say, oh, well, it's because of the diving accident. Some of you know that Dave Brubeck was in a diving accident in Hawaii in the 50s, and it was very serious. Apparently, whoever rescued him thought like he wasn't going to make it, and he had some lasting, damage that caused tingling sensation. There are questions about how it affected his playing, and so people would sometimes reflect back and say, well, he didn't play virtuosically, he didn't play rapid fire, because of that accident. And that's not it. We see him here. He's, in his 70s in this video, and he's playing just fine. He said he's shredding. When I say shredding, I think what everyone knows. I mean, that's colloquial musician speak for playing very virtuosically. And the truth is that most of the time, that just wasn't his preferred aesthetic. He was a storyteller. He wasn't a shredder. He was a storyteller. What do I mean by that? It was more about the vertical sonorities. This note with that note with that note, and you pile them up, and what do you get? It was more about melody and weaving together a contour rather than just pyrotechnics. But when he wanted to do the pyrotechnics, he could, as we see here in this video. All right, so that's Unsquare Dance. And now you all will have 7/4. Anyone ever asks you, hey, name something in 7/4, and you'll impress them so quickly. You'll say, 7/4, easy. Unsquare Dance from Time Further Out, 1961. Next. Okay, here's one that doesn't feature a particularly crazy time signature, but this is also on the album, and I wanted to share it because it gives us a window into Dave's life, his family life, which should interest us, I think, because I was telling Michael, we realize when we look at these pictures from the archives, whether it's Dave in a kimono or, posing with a Buddhist priest or a Shaolin monk or whatever it is, you realize that they're people like us, composers, artists, no matter how famous and how successful, they're people just like us. And just like us, they have children. Or they don't, but in this case, Dave Brubeck and Iola Brubeck had 6 children. And here in 1961, Charles Matthew, better known as Matt, was born. And Dave wrote a piece to celebrate it. It's called the Charles Matthew Hallelujah. Remy Balduc is playing here. He's a French-Canadian tenor sax player. And what you'll notice is, I think just about everyone here probably knows a piece from 1741. It closes the second part of the oratorio. It sounds like this. And if you listen, what's in the sax line, it's these snippets of the Hallelujah theme from Handel. Have a listen for it. Do you hear that? Hallelujah. It's the same rhythm too. And beep, 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 beep. So long, short, deep, dub. Why it's doing that. I'm just going to reload all of these before we listen. From now on, I've learned my lesson. Okay, that's why. I saw a great picture. Those of you who know the Wicked movie just came out, right? And it's making a lot of waves in musical theater circles, where I spend a lot of time, incidentally. And there was a sign at one theater that said, please allow the other patrons to enjoy the show. The sing-along version is coming in December. All right. You can hear Handel, right? Just a blues, by the way. Blues, just like Unsquare Dance. Five chords. That's some blistering playing there from Remy Balduc, that French-Canadian sax player. All right, one more track from 1961, and then we'll jump ahead to the next albums we're going to talk about. What was initially a very challenging prospect for the quartet, as evidenced in those studio outtakes that we listened to last spring, the prospect of playing in quintuple meter may have been daunting once upon a time, but by 1961, not the case anymore. The quartet had gotten it down like a well-oiled machine now. They could play in 5/4, they could solo in 5/4, they could do anything they wanted in 5/4. And so there are a couple of tracks in quintuple meter. Remember that quintuple meter is another variant of the duple plus triple theme, right? Whereas Unsquare Dance was 4+3, 4 being a variant of duple and triple. 5/4 would be 3+2. And that was the meter of take 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we get the same thing here, but now with a different feel, but still percussion heavy. And there aren't many live videos of the quartet playing around this time, playing these tracks from this album, not at least that are available on YouTube. But here's Castilian blues, Castilian drums. I mentioned that there's a lot of blues influence. It's in Unsquare Dance, it's in Charles Matthew Hallelujah, and it's in this one as well. This is going to be a song that's going to feature not only the regular members of the quartet, but especially Joe Morello on the drums. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2. Can you hear that 5? I promised I was going to reload everything, and I didn't. Fool me once. Okay. See what he's doing here? He was playing with the beat. Now watch what he does. I'm going to rewind it 5 seconds or so. And note how he starts playing against the beat. 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You hear that? that, that tension when you're playing against the rhythm section, that's the bass and the drums, why do you do it? Well, if you've got really good rhythm players like Joe Morello and Wright, what you can do is you can create a lot of tension. Usually tension in music is thought to be created by aural dissonances that come because the tones are in close proximity, or you have intervals like sevenths or tritones, you know, these intervals like this. You know, here's a major seventh, here's a tritone. You know, you can have minor seconds. You can have dissonance like that. This is what I would call rhythmic dissonance. And like any other kind of dissonance, when it resolves, it is a musical equivalent of sinking into a warm bath. It's a very pleasant sensation on the ear because you're waiting for some kind of catharsis, some release from the tension. So Dave was so good at this, and I'm saying this not to get too technical, but rather to give you a sense of what you might listen for. I think it's an important idea to expand upon, because when we listen, you know, Aaron Copland was famously asked in an interview he gave for CUNY, my old employer, CUNY, you know, City University of New York, in 1980. So he was already sort of an elder statesman of the concert hall. And what he said was, he was asked, what's a big problem with music today? And in the 80s, you know, Copland said, he said, the problem with music today, i.e. in the early 80s, is music has become wallpaper. So one of the things I encourage my students to do, and I would encourage everyone to do, is when you listen, listen for something. Yes, we can appreciate it because it's beautiful. We don't need any other reason than that, or it's interesting. We don't need any other reason than that. But it's a nice, fun challenge, I think, to ask ourselves, what are we really hearing here? And when we hear something like, for example, the stride piano excerpt that we saw in Unsquare Dance, or, for example, what Dave is doing here, playing against the quintuple meter. After asserting it firmly, he then goes against it, creating tension with the rhythm section, which then resolves, giving us a very pleasant sensation when things lock in again. These are good things to listen for. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1. Wow. Drum solo. Dave is amused, you could tell. hard to overstate how difficult it is to do what we just heard. This idea of soloing in 5/4 where there's no rhythm section to help you. You are the rhythm section. So what you see Joe Morello doing there is he's keeping the 5/4 pattern on the hi-hat with his left foot and his right foot with the bass drum. And then the hands are just doing something completely different. And it's, you know, we watch it and we understand that there's something sort of special and daring about it. But to understand how difficult it is on a technical level to execute like that, all we have to do is go back a couple of years, 3 years prior to this in 1959, listen to Joe Morello in the studio takes for when they were recording Take 5. Initially, the theme for Take 5 was envisioned as a percussion solo. And then, you know, Paul Desmond came up with this melody that became so iconic. But initially, it was supposed to be a percussion thing. And if you listen to some of those early studio takes, Michael and I listened to them last spring together, and you get the sense that it's like there's a timidity to the playing. They're feeling it out, seeing what can you do here? What does it feel like in this new rhythmic zone? And you fast forward a few years, and you get this, you know, absolutely, you know, daring display of percussion brilliance. It's good stuff. Now that track we just listened to, Castilian Blues, Castilian Drums, comes from an album from 1962, which came right after Time Further Out. So again, let's do the math. 1959, Time Out, featuring Take 5 and Blue Rondo, and all these songs that the quartet members, you know, they probably thought it would do modestly with audiences, but they were probably under the impression, I think with justification, that because the material was admittedly esoteric, remember, nobody had done it before, they were probably thinking it would do okay. They did not envision that it would do so well and that Take 5 especially would take off. Which brings me to the title of our second album of the evening. Remember, we said Take 5 was on 1959's Time Out. Unsquare Dance was on 1961's Time Further Out. But when you think about the 60s, I think many of us think of space exploration. And certainly Dave Brubeck must have been thinking about that, because the next album, and the one that features the song we just listened to, came out in 1962, and it shows us a few things. One, Dave was interested in space travel, because the album is called Countdown, Time in Outer Space, and it was dedicated to John Glenn. The other thing it tells us is that the quartet was not through exploring time signatures. Remember what we said, it wasn't a one-off, it wasn't a gimmick. It was a thorough, almost encyclopedic, comprehensive exploration of time signatures, and way more than we can do tonight. But if you're going to check out one song from this album that we're not going to get to tonight, I would say check out a song that was actually written by Paul Desmond on this album. It's called 11/4. Not the most imaginative song title. It's in 11/4 time. So how can you divide 11/4? Well, one way to do it might be 4 + 4 + 3. Or you could have 3 + 3 + 3 + 2, right? So you could, 11's a little bit more flexible, I would say. Just like in, do you remember in Blue Rondo a la Turk, it's in 9/8 nominally, but the 9/8, it could be 3 + 3 + 3, or more often it's 2 + 2 + 2 + 3, right? It could be 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3. So you can subdivide within the odd meter, because it wasn't complicated enough, right? All right. Here's the title track to Countdown. And you could see the art here. I think this was Franz Klein, I think, was the artist who did this one. You know, you could see that Dave was very into postmodern art. You know, he was into expressionism. He was into, you know, the sort of, you know, artists like Newman, and obviously Jackson Pollock comes to mind. You know, artists who were, you know, doing abstract things on the canvas. Note, by the way, the timpani here. We heard a little bit of timpani in Jazz Impressions of Japan, if you remember. And here's timpani around the same time. This is a couple of years prior to the trip to Japan. Once again, blues, right? I always tell myself I'll do it, and then I don't do it. My daughter has a good trick to fix this. You know what she says? When the video doesn't work, she points at her iPad and she says, play. I said play. All right. Hard to tell what the meter is, right? You get it too. Do you hear that figuration in the left hand? Those alternating broken octaves, we sometimes refer to that as boogie woogie piano. We associate it with earlier figures like Earl Hines or Fats Waller. You can hear, again, when Dave wanted to play that style, he could. So we get more odd meter playing. But probably the most famous track on the album was one that Dave and the quartet had recorded, believe it or not, in 1957 for a little known album that I would encourage you all to check out. It's called Dave Digs Disney. A nice alliterative title. Some of you know that Dave had been interested clearly in arranging in a jazz idiom songs that had been famous in other idioms, like Disney songs, or if you know the Leonard Bernstein album, that's a great album. He takes these songs from West Side Story and he transforms them into, real jazz classics. One of the songs that Dave reimagined both in 1957 and again in 1962, Someday My Prince Will Come, which was in the original 1937 Snow White movie. So here's Dave. You can see this is in 2007. One of the most amazing things about Dave Brubeck's legacy, I think people will write about and talk about, is his longevity as a performer. This is a guy who was born in 1920. And here it's 2007. So he's going to turn 90 in a couple years. This is a couple years before he receives his Kennedy Honors, which I think was in 2009. Here he is in 2007, and clearly, you tell that big, bright Dave Brubeck smile, ready to play some music.
You feel like playing the piano for us?
You bet.
I was hoping you'd say that. Ladies and gentlemen, Dave Brubeck.
Very famous Disney song from sort of the Golden Age Disney era. Now it's a waltz. Listen to these polyrhythms he's doing here. It's going 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. A waltz, right? A 1, 2, 3, 1. Now he's going to go ba, 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 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. So he's going to deliberately subvert the waltz feel by playing dotted quarter notes against the quarter note, and essentially creating a 2 against 3 feeling. So here he is in his late 80s, and he's still up to his old mischievous polyrhythmic games here, and it sounds delightful. Have a listen to the polyrhythm stuff. 1, 2, 3. I want to make sure we have time to cover at least one song from the third album in our triumvirate from tonight, and then I want to leave time for questions. So I'll just end this one by saying we should all be so lucky to be in our late 80s and to be so joyously playing and sharing music. All right, next album, 1964, and it's an album I should say called Time Changes. Now this is obviously a pun, right? Time changes, that's a term in jazz. When we talk about changes, we talk about chord changes. What are the changes? It's something someone might say in a jam session, or if you were picking up in a studio on short notice, just give me the changes, man. That means give me the chord progression. Time change, of course, refers to the fact that time was going on, marching on inexorably, and big things were happening. The world was shrinking, as evidenced in 1964-65 in the World Fair, that famous expo that took place in Flushing Meadow, Corona Park. Was the second time it was there. It was also there in the late 30s, I believe. I was telling Michael before the program started, this is actually exactly where I got engaged, right in front of the Unisphere. Turned out my wife and I, when we met in 2014, we thought we'd never crossed paths before. And then one day we're driving on the Grand Central Parkway, and I said, I was in a show in that theater in the park. And she said, well, what show is it? I said, it was called Tumbleweeds. It was like a throwaway, Western with bad music, but whatever. I was 13. It was 1997. She's 3 years my junior. She said, 97, you say? Huh. I think I was in a show there too, but I was like 9 or 10, so I don't remember. Turns out her mother had kept all the programs and even a VHS cassette. And even though we thought we had never met, it turns out we were on stage together in 1997. So that's where I proposed to her. So the Unisphere has special meaning to me, and here's Dave and as they say in Yiddish, the ganze Mishpacha. Everybody, the whole family's here. And you could see there's Matt, who was the dedicatee of Charles Matthew Hallelujah in 1961. Here we are in 1964-65, and our little boy has grown up. Anyway, there's Dave with that signature Dave Brubeck smile on his face. There's a few other figures in the picture as well. What's great about this is that we get a time signature that we haven't actually encountered yet, and it's in a song, actually, believe it or not, called World's Fair. Remember, the World's Fair was basically a big expo. Hey, folks, come on down to Flushing Meadow, Corona, Queens, and try a Belgian waffle. Well, like every other trip he took or every other event he beheld, it seems that the wheels were always turning and everything could potentially be grist for the mill for Dave Brubeck. Remember in our last program, we talked about his trip to Japan, the trip to Mexico in 67, the trip to Japan in 64, and we said the cogs were spinning. He did not stop. And World's Fair is a really fun song. It's up-tempo, and the meter's odd. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but I will tell you it's one we haven't done. So let's listen to it, see if we can puzzle it out. And then you see more sort of postmodern art here. And see if you can hear what the pattern is. Sometimes it's obvious. Obvious, that's relative. Sometimes it's clearer. Sometimes it's less clear. Remember, that's because they deliberately obfuscate the meter at times. Let's listen. Have a listen. All right, so what do we have? Add up. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2. So that's 3, 3, 3 is 9, 2, 2 is 4, 9 and 4 is 13/8. Can you write music in 13/8? Apparently you can. Apparently you can. Let's listen to the rest of the track. It gets to a very exciting moment. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Here's Dave playing against the meter. Notice the drums are doing something different. Not easy to play. It's fascinating, and I'll end with this because there's a lot more to say about odd meters and the influences that Brubeck had on later generations, younger musicians, even outside of the jazz world. I would say especially outside of the jazz world, people like Emerson, Lake, and Palmer. People who were exploring odd meter in the 1970s, say, for example, in the progressive rock realm, bands like Jethro Tull, musicians like Ian Anderson, musicians in bands like Yes, Genesis, they were really interested. All of a sudden in the 1970s, you see this explosion of odd meters in rock. Where do you think it comes from? We have to admit, and many of these musicians are on record, doffing their caps to Dave Brubeck and saying that it came from jazz, it came from Brubeck, that he had opened this door. And what I would say about this, last track that we listened to is, after 13/8, at that point, right, you want to start respelling things like it's 4/4 plus 7/8. You wouldn't say 15/8 most likely, because once the bar gets too long, you need a bar line to help divide things. 13/8 is probably where most people would call the limit, and here you have the band playing so fluidly at a fast tempo, 13/8. And what's interesting about it is you go back 5 years, listen to those recordings. I encourage everybody, go into the archives, listen to the studio outtakes from the Take 5 recording process. And you see how it must have been such a challenge because of the novelty. And because when you learn music and you're so used to playing in common time or 3/4 triple meter, playing outside of that, it's like growing a sixth finger and trying to use it somehow. It feels so awkward and unruly. And then you take those recordings from 1959 in the studio when they were struggling, juxtapose them against this. What a difference. And it just tells you how dedicated Dave and the other band members were to fully exploring odd meter. And that means not only writing in these meters, but learning how to play, and more importantly, learning how to improvise. And that's really hard to do. So I think we've learned something new about Dave Brubeck tonight, I hope. And I will hope that many of you will join me in 2 weeks when we're back. We're going to be talking about Dave Brubeck, faith, family, legacy. Got some great music there, including some music written for larger ensembles, even choruses. Dave was really, some of you know that he rejected the idea that he converted to Catholicism. He would say something more like, I just happened to join the Catholic Church. That influenced him a lot in the later, decades of his life and in his career. So there's great music to explore there. And we're also going to be looking at some of the recordings he made with his sons. You know, those were very famous recordings. And then we'll finally end with some, let's call it a Dave Brubeck Christmas treat for us. Some of you know that Brubeck recorded some Christmas music. And those arrangements are really imaginative and whimsical and fantastic. So we're going to end our little mini-series in December with Brubeck's Faith, Family, Holidays, good fun, good cheer. I hope you join me then. But in the meantime, Michael, I see you got a microphone. I'd be happy to take any questions. Yes. This is World's Fair. World's Fair. That's the name of the piece. Yep. World's Fair. 13/8 time. Yada pa pa da pa pa da pa pi da pi da pi da pa pi da pa pi da pa. Yep, that's it. It really is. You know, it's the beginning of it harmonically is way out there. We have to remember that in 1964, jazz was going, you know, some of you remember this from my talk last spring when I talked about postmodernism and free jazz. And the quartet resisted that. You know, we listened to an album from 1967 in our last meeting, and we saw that that's, you know, there was nothing atonal or amorphous about it. It had real contour, shape, structure, key, tonality, etc. But you could tell that they were experimenting a little bit here. You listen to the beginning, you listen to what Paul's playing against what Dave's playing. It's pretty dissonant, and it seems to reject temporarily any sense of key, although they do settle into one later. Good question.
Hi. I've heard that while Dave attributed the beginning of this to Joe Morello, that Max Roach claimed to have been there first, and perhaps Morello, either directly or indirectly, got the idea from Roach.
It's a great question. I'm going to do what any good professor should do, which is to say, I can't think of any particular piece that Max Roach recorded in odd meter. So I'm going to have to look into that. And I'll look it up, and I'll get back to you in the next program if I remember. If you ask me, I'm going to look it up today. So if you remind me next time, I'll share it. What I would say about it, without having investigated the question very fully, whether Max Roach played or recorded in 5/4, two things are possible. One, that he played, Morello heard him, and was just never recorded. It might have been a jam session or something fun, something that was sort of musicians goofing off, right? And that might have influenced it. And two, Max Roach was a noted percussion and rhythm virtuoso. So that he played in odd meter does not surprise me. That wouldn't surprise me. But what I'm curious is if he ever recorded in odd meter. I don't think he did, but I'm not a Max Roach scholar, so it's going to be something I'm going to look up, and we're going to get back to it in 2 weeks. Good question. A question, yes. Good question. Was there ever a backlash to writing in these odd meters? In other words, people who wanted to dance maybe or snap along, and gosh darn it, I can't snap to this one. You ruined the song. Nothing like that. What I would say is that Time Changes was the least warmly reviewed album of the three that we discussed tonight. So Time Out, 1959, acclaimed. Then you've got three follow-ups. Time Further Out, very, very warmly received. In fact, some claimed it was even better than Time Out. Countdown, Time in Outer Space, also warmly received. Time Changes, not as warmly received. I think All Music gave it like 3 or something, 3 out of 5 stars, which like All Music is not the ultimate arbiter, but it's an indication of how it's been received. I think, you know, for some listeners, they may have felt by 1964 that like, yeah, we get it. We get it. But, you know, I chose what I think is one of the best tracks on the album. There's others we could listen to where we might not be so impressed. But, you know, that's, what do critics know, right? Critics, I mentioned Wicked earlier. You know, Wicked did very lukewarm reviews when it was in workshop phase out in San Francisco. People thought like, might sell a few tickets. And then it went on and, you know, became a juggernaut 20 years later. That's now been made into a feature film pairing. So, you know, critics don't always have it right. But I would say that the critics didn't like Time Changes as much as Countdown or Time Further Out. Good question.
Well, I think we've got it. Thanks very much, Gil.
My pleasure. Folks, I hope we have good weather 2 weeks from now so that we can reconvene one more time in 2024 and put a little ribbon on this particular mini-series on Dave Brubeck. We got plenty more programming coming for you in 2025. Michael and I are already putting our heads together. Give it up for Michael, everybody, because he does. Have a good night. Get home safe.